I have a wonderful panel. My name is Larry Downs. I'm a project director here at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. And this particular panel will focus on the last part of that. We're going to talk about the public policy. So obviously, we already heard this morning in terms of both the technical and the economic or business case aspects of smart cities. We already heard a lot of policy stuff, or at least policy questions, and in fact, Brian Hendricks very graciously gave us a question that he wanted us to address, which was, of course, already on our list. So clearly, I think more than in other kinds of applications, because these do involve cities or other governmental entities, policy is unavoidable and to talk about it. And what we want to do is just sort of talk about ways in which policy decisions can be both helpful and harmful, and sometimes unintentionally, in deploying the kinds of applications that might otherwise improve quality of life for residents. So I have a long list of policy topics. We'll get through all of them, but happily I have a very diverse panel this afternoon to talk about these. I'm going to introduce them going down the line here. Very briefly, you have their full bios if you want to look at them, but starting on my left, Jamie Hastings, who's Senior Vice President of External and State Affairs for CTIA. Do you still say CTIA, the wireless organization?
Everything wireless.
Okay, everything wireless. Next to Jamie is Erin McGrath, who's a legal advisor for wireless issues for Commissioner Michael O'Reilly at the FCC. Linda Kinney, who's a senior advisor on internet policy for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, aka NTIA, which is part of the Department of Commerce. Charla Rath, for Vice President of Wireless Policy Development for Verizon. So earlier today, you missed it. We were looking for a carrier to pick on, and since there was nobody in Verizon in the room, they picked Verizon.
The second kid.
That's all right. You can get.
Can you give me more detail on that, please?
AT&T was on the panel.
And then last but not least, at the end of the table is Berge Ayvazian, industry analyst and consultant with Wireless 2020. So let's start. I think what I want to do, I'm going to sort of ask the first question and the last question to Linda, as not our only government representative, but as coming from a sort of different viewpoint of government, and as opposed to industry or in Erin's case, a regulatory agency. Let's start by talking about sort of some of the infrastructure issues that we heard about. So let me start with you, Linda, and then the other panelists can react to it, and I'll ask a follow-up. But can you tell us sort of some examples of things that, from your standpoint and from NTI's standpoint, what can government do to create the right policy and regulatory environment to sustain long-term private sector investment, particularly here, and we're talking about investment actually in cities and other entities like that?
So I think a few things, and I apologize for being the first panel and the first speaker after lunch, so hopefully we can keep everybody awake. So I think there are a couple things. First of all, the United States, especially in the wireless area, has created the environment, I think, that is enviable. By that I mean what the regulators have done, and this has been a very concerted policy for many years, even more important now that things are moving so rapidly. But the United States did a bunch of things. First of all, we believe in innovation and the private sector. And as one of the earlier panelists mentioned, they said, government is not good at technology. Well, that's not coming from me. That was another panelist who said that, but I'm just underscoring the sentiment. And so realizing that and being humble as regulators, as a government, and trying to create an environment that allows for flexibility and innovation. So wireless is a great example of that. The FCC for many years, and NTIA actually came up with some of the early thinking and thought leadership on this, created a regulatory environment where there's flexibility. So we allow people to use their spectrum how they want, where they want, when they want. Very different than other countries who, in this example, like right now in smart cities and Internet of Things, are actually coming up with a piece of spectrum that is for Internet of Things or smart cities. You have to use this piece of spectrum. Well, there you go, right away it cuts off in innovation because you're limiting how the spectrum is going to be used. So that's one example of regulatory area that we definitely believe and promote innovation. I think the other thing that we're...
Sorry to interrupt you. We'll come back to spectrum. That'll be the next topic, but I didn't mean to interrupt you, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. And then also on the infrastructure side, there are a number of things that we've been looking at. So one of the policies and that is really, we're hearing a lot from the private sector coming in talking about particularly in deploying 5G, that there are going to be many more cell sites, and so the permitting is really an issue. And when you're rolling out the infrastructure, you may need many more permits, many more drops, in cities in particular, as you're rolling out the smart city technologies. And so one of the things that we've been focused on is figuring out and talking to cities as well as the industry about public-private partnerships and how to collaborate together, and also focus on how you could line up incentives. So we've been hearing from some industry folks who are coming in who may be struggling with some of the permit problems. When they come and they offer the cities something that they want, and it may be Wi-Fi, public Wi-Fi, for instance, then they can work together and they're able to then deploy their services in a way that facilitates, streamlines the permitting process, and the cities benefit as well, and that way you get a win-win situation. And I know there are a lot of different projects. That's just one small example, but luckily we have Verizon also on the panel, because I know they've been working closely with the city of Boston on rolling out some of these things. So that's an example of an infrastructure.
Great, okay.
Can I quickly follow up on what?
Sure.
Just as the sister agency to NTIA, absolutely agreed, and a lot of what I would say would replicate what Linda just said. But as we were here on a panel on 5G and smart cities, those are concepts. They're concepts that aren't 100% defined. We know we have aspirational goals. We have this idea of these great cities where you have connected cars and you can use Wi-Fi anywhere. But the commission, what we do best is we're providing the inputs to achieve that vision. So, as Linda said, spectrum and infrastructure, which I know will come up later, those are things that we are trying to get out there and that we are trying to facilitate. So, as you said, government, or someone said, government shouldn't, or is not good at technology. I would put it this way. The government shouldn't determine technology. So what the FCC tries to do is get out there what industry needs, what cities need, and then let them innovate under flexible rules to come up with the next technologies that will benefit the American consumer. And one last thing is that what made the U.S. Wireless industry what it is today was a hands-off approach to regulation. And that is something that we have to continue. We've been encroaching more and more on making decisions as to how wireless providers will manage their networks, or exactly how things should look, and the government really should not be there, because what we need is to provide the input and then let the people who do infrastructure and networks best take over.
Okay, so now I want to thank you for that. Let me get sort of an industry perspective, and I'm going to ask the same question. I'm going to ask first Jamie, and then Charla, and then Berge to answer this question. So certainly we heard that whether it's 5G, Internet of Things, smart cities, whatever it is, that there's certainly technology trend now in the next generation of mobile technologies that emphasize small cells, much more dense cells, and sort of, smaller things that use less power, but lots more of them in lots more locations. So what does that technological reality, I guess, do in terms of the existing legal and policy environment, and knowing that this is coming, particularly over the next 5 to 10 years, preemptively, what would make sense, again, on a win-win basis, in terms of changes to the existing structure, the existing policy, that will make that happen in a way, that's most efficient and most beneficial, both to the cities and the residents, as well as providing the financial incentives that industry needs. So I'm going to start with you, Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Larry. So we are operating in a macro cell environment. We are trying to get microcells, small cells, installed in a macro cell environment. So in many cases, for a small cell, the approval process is anywhere from 18 to 24 months, which is the same as for a 150-foot tower. There was an instance where a carrier went in and submitted 160 applications because, again, these are small and they densify. 20 were approved. We are in an environment where there are no clearly defined and reasonable regulations with respect to small cells, and we've got to get there. So CTIA and our member companies really support three principles. One is access, particularly to municipal poles in rights of way. Reasonable costs. So in many cases, our members are paying as much as 300% more in rent for access to these poles than others who are accessing them. In addition, there are consultants across the country who are being paid on a contingency basis. So the higher the rent, if we can call it that, the more the consultant makes.
And the longer the period of reviewing the application.
Exactly, exactly. So we've got to get to a place where there are reasonable costs. And then finally, there needs to be a streamlined process. There needs to be a way that one of our members can go in with 200 applications, and there is a streamlined process perhaps for batching those applications. And in addition, there has to be deemed approved language or deemed granted language, similar to what the FCC did with the shot clock provisions when those were adopted, and as well as in some states where we've been pushing that. The only way that we are going to get the kinds of economic development that we're talking about with respect to 5G, and indeed densifying 4G, is through clearly defined and reasonable regulations.
Okay. Charla, do you want, do you
Yeah,
may have
sure.
slightly different, or you may have a completely
Well,
different
a couple of things I wanted to say. One is that, obviously we agree with where CTIA is on this. And, it is interesting because the Commission has clearly attempted to do what it can, has a number of things have happened. But one of the things I always like to do is sort of step back, and this is an Aesop's fable from when I was a kid about the man with the cloak on who actually the north wind and the sun actually took a bet. Who's going to be able to get him to remove his cloak? Well, the north wind blew and blew and blew. Didn't work. He just wrapped himself more tightly. The sun shone, and guess what? He took off his cloak. And it is, as everybody knows, it's a parable for persuasion. And really what that says to me is what we need to be doing and what we are doing. I mean, you had mentioned Boston. We need to actually be working very closely with these communities and bringing to them not just the sense of what they need to do to help us, but what we're actually doing to help them achieve certain goals and certain things that they're trying to do. And, I think it's interesting because the whole concept of smart cities, smart communities is one that, in fact, we're sort of coming at it from many different perspectives, and it's probably a Rashomon type of exercise. But ultimately, there is a value to all of us as citizens of individual communities, and there's a value to the communities. And frankly, I think we've done a very good job of saying what you need to do, but I do feel like we need to step up to this and explain it better about what you're going to get and why this is important to you as a community. And frankly, that's what has worked for us in Boston. It's been a very collaborative relationship there. And that, by the way, also just to say, that's not just about 5G, that's not just, it's more about true infrastructure in a city that allow them to do a number of different things that they want to do. So, you know, that's really in some ways my pitch, and unfortunately, Larry, it's not really a policy play. I mean, it's a policy play, but it's not really a regulatory or a legal play. It's more, you know, you need to really meet people where they are and understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish as cities. It's a lot of work. I mean, there are, you know, what, 20,000 municipalities in the United States, but I also think you get that, you can get kind of a running start, and people start to see, well, we could do it two ways. We could be in constant, just a constant fight with people we want to bring in, or we can actually try and work with them.
So it may not be a policy thing, but it's certainly working with governments.
Yeah.
So it's government one way or the other.
And so, Larry, to play off that, and Charla, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is key. And I think, you know, we have such a good story to tell. Mm-hmm. There was a time when we were talking about infrastructure, and the only thing that we could say was, you can text more.
Which is important to a group of people in this country.
No, it is, and it's terribly important, but you get where I'm going.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, you can text more, and that is still great, with deference to all the millennials and under in the room. But we have such a great story to tell.
Yeah,
this time we've got such a great story
to tell. The
to
other thing, and obviously I don't want to take too much time on this, the other thing that you had alluded to, and I want to make sure that everybody is completely aware of, and I suspect, you know, sorry I wasn't able to be here today in the morning, I don't know, I felt like I had to go. Our general counsel said he was going to have a, all hands meeting, so I sort of figured I better show up, and he planned it after I agreed to do this, so sorry about that. And I suspect everybody's been talking about it, but we are going full force already on densifying our networks. We're running as fast as we can to, meet demand in a 4G world, and it'll be much more complicated. And I think it's also going to involve things that we're not even thinking about how we build buildings, for example. I shouldn't say we're not thinking about it. Clearly,
well, that's a perfect segue to Berge, because we were talking at lunch. It comes from a very different perspective, and how we build buildings is sort of part of it. But give us sort of your viewpoint, and kind of maybe help the audience see how you approach this problem, why you might have a slightly different view of the regulatory and policy version of infrastructure based on sort of on-the-ground experience that you have.
Good, thank you for that. You mentioned, by the way, I'm the only boy on the panel.
I said that at lunch. I didn't say that in public.
I know you didn't want me to repeat it, but in any case, they sat me at the end so I wouldn't grope anybody. But in any case, I'm sorry. What I really meant to say is I don't think that's really the distinction at all among us. What I'm going to try and do, I have two hats. Like Peter, I'm an industry analyst, but more importantly, I'm a consultant, and most of my clients are operators, mostly wireless operators around the world, and what we've been doing for them for the last 10 years is build their 4G business cases and help them to get a sense of how their return on investment can be derived by a variety of different ways to monetize their 4G networks. And if you think about how 4G started, it's nothing like what today's monetization schemes are like today. So it's evolved quite a bit. And just to focus a bit on densification, we've been focused a lot for the last 2-3 years on how do we achieve densification. And what I'm really concerned about is we've actually developed another set of clients, which are the cities, that are faced with the challenge of how do we allow and help the mobile industry densify, while at the same time avoiding creating chaos in the city in which there are 18,000 pending applications from 7 different companies, 3 of which claim to represent the other 4 carriers, but we don't know for sure. And we can't really figure out how to align their interests so that instead of having them each require separate siting, separate permitting here and there or whatever, like McDonald's and Burger King on opposite sides of every street, we can actually create some order. And in addition, have not only a policy framework, but an economic framework that allows the city and its residents to benefit from all sides of this process of densification. So what we've been doing is helping cities to look at the problem they're facing and look at the challenge of densification from a realistic perspective and actually work collaboratively with carriers. And I'm pleased that you used that term because cities are not the enemy. They're not the obstacle. They are, in fact, a common partner that has to be part of the process. They not only benefit from densification, but in fact, their future IoT applications depend on a densified network. So they want it as much as anybody else. On the other hand, they are inundated with expectations and requirements which are not being presented to them in an orderly manner. So when they have a flood of applications for permits and requests from all these different companies, and in fact, each wants to deploy their own equipment. They don't want to cooperate. They don't want to co-locate. They don't want to share backhaul. They don't want to share power. They don't want to put them in the same physical locations because they're competing with each other. And the few cases where there are common neutral host providers, they themselves have difficulty getting sharing to really occur. So having that cooperation so that, like the towers, which you alluded to in the beginning of this, where in fact there are many carriers on a common tower, and carriers are out of the tower business. They don't own towers anymore. Third parties own them. And by definition, they share the towers. That's the nature of the business. They need to be able to share common infrastructure, which we call neutral host. That doesn't mean that it has to all be that way, but there has to be a way for cities to get their arms around this problem and to turn what is a problem into a solution. So we heard already today about the kiosks in New York, right? When they started the project, it was a project to replace payphones and to create free Wi-Fi around payphones. Well, in fact, these originally were Verizon payphones at the beginning of time. They became in disuse and abused and torn apart and everything else, and half of them were dysfunctional. Now they're turning them into these Wi-Fi kiosks, but the question is, why couldn't they house small cells? These are perfectly located in traffic zones. They have power already. They're at a place where you could easily house 2, 3, 4 small cells. Now, just so happened the city of New York didn't think of that when they started, and they started focusing it on Wi-Fi. Now they're rethinking, and in fact, we're working with them now to create a business case around having small cells housed in not only those kiosks, but in bus shelters, in digital signage, outdoor advertising, and in a variety of different kinds of infrastructure. We talked a bit about light poles. Better lighting is an important improvement for cities. Having reduced operating costs for that lighting is an important part of the priorities for these cities. Well, in fact, Philips and Ericsson came together and created a light pole that houses small cells. And it does so with a very quick ROI, in which not only is there savings from the LED, but there's revenue from leasing the space inside the light pole to carriers to put their small cells. What they haven't done, though, is figured out how to have a multi-carrier small cell that could service 2, 3, 4 carriers from a single physical light pole. Right now, each one has to have their own because each one has their own vendor, their own spectrum requirements, and their own, let's say, aversion to sharing. So right now, we're at a turning point where the enemy is becoming not only a friend, but a collaborator. And I think cities and carriers and government agencies have to sit down together and sort these problems out. This is not an adversarial process by any means. And I don't like being characterized as a consultant that's trying to raise the prices, because that's not at all what we're doing. As a consultant to cities, our job is not to raise the cost for carriers. I get nothing from doing that. In fact, my job is to make the business case work. And if we can make it work for all parties, that's what we're trying to achieve.
I didn't say everyone was a bad actor.
I'm sorry.
You don't work on contingency. So thank you very much for that. I want to move to the next topic. Before I do, I want just a quick follow-up for Erin, because this is a unique situation. When we talk about infrastructure, it's really shared regulatory authority of the federal and state. And there's a lot of dispute, frankly, about how much of it should be federal and how much of it should be state. And as the kind of the value of this starts to ramp up, and the money that may or may not be involved, it's likely to become more contentious. Let's say that. What's your perspective on this? Should we leave it to the states and local municipalities? Is there a federal role in setting up policies about infrastructure and siting and so on? What do you think?
Well, the FCC has already taken steps to try to facilitate infrastructure sharing. Most of it has been centered around co-locating facilities and relieving historic preservation requirements, because the issues that face infrastructure siting are multiple, because you have historic preservation, you have environmental concerns, you then have localities, you then have tribes. The tribal governments also get in there. So, currently, what the commission has been focusing on, after we took care of some basic co-location issues, which Charla was nice enough to mention, is we respond to the concerns that are brought to us most of the time. So we're hearing issues with rights of way, and those issues are somewhat twofold: permitting processes and fees. So where the commission is probably going to concentrate its time are those circumstances where we actually have concrete evidence that there may be a problem. And that's not to say that all municipalities, localities are a problem. No. They're not. Unfortunately, sometimes the bad actors tar the rest. And there's also tribal governments that are charging large fees for siting in areas where they claim interest. So those are the areas where we're looking. The collaborative process is always best. But if that doesn't work, then you're in the situation where the government may have to get involved. Okay. Now, what that would look like at this point is questionable, but I mean, it can go all the way from, tweaking interpretations and rules around the edges to preemption. Yeah. I mean, one is the most extreme. Collaboration is, the easiest in keeping the government out of it. But
well, carrots are always good as long as you have a stick.
There's always a stick behind it. Yes.
All right. We could keep talking this, but we have a lot of other topics to cover. So I want to, I want to move on. Obviously, infrastructure, which we just talked about, is one of the two major inputs to any of the applications that were discussed earlier today. The other major input, of course, is spectrum, is radio frequency spectrum. I thought the way to sort of approach this is to think back. So we've had, and I think, by the way, most of you agree, we've actually had some very good developments in this respect. But a lot of what we've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years really came out of the National Broadband Plan and what it said about spectrum in 2010. And yet, of course, the National Broadband Plan, not to its criticism in any way, but it did not foresee 5G networks. It did not foresee, well, it did talk about smart cities, but certainly didn't have the knowledge we have now about how quickly and what those things are going to look like. So in terms of spectrum, do we need a new plan? Is the path we're on now going to meet the requirements that we now have a much better understanding of? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to rewrite it from scratch? How do we think about that? And let me start with you, Charla, on this.
Sure. It's hard to say. I mean, do we need a new plan? Do we actually need to go through the process every 6 or 8 years to do a serious spectrum plan? I mean, we have done that. It's funny when you look back at the history. And the issue is going to be is that plan will always be out of date fairly quickly because, I mean, like you said, 5G, well, nobody even, the iPad wasn't in there. There was a lot of stuff that wasn't in there. But there was also a lot that was, and it is being implemented now, a lot to do with providing incentives, a lot to do with actually making spectrum, more flexible, so that certain uses of spectrum where you couldn't do X, you'd now get rid of that issue. And that's actually how the Commission has been able to pull together, I think, 245 megahertz? I forget what the number is.
Not counting millimeter
So
wave.
I think as, first off, as an aspirational goal, to have a goal to say, we need to get this much spectrum out there, acknowledging the fact that, the commercial needs are going to increase no matter how efficient you are with your use of spectrum. And what that's about is it's not about, one commercial operator versus another, it's about the consumer. It's about, consumer demand, and as we all know, that most people walk around and they do everything with a handheld device or with an iPad. Nobody uses a wireline phone except probably in your offices. Even, I have one at home, and, I have an argument with my husband, would you check the voicemail, because nobody ever calls me on it.
Yes.
And it's, so there's definitely a lot that changes. In all fairness, what should happen is it should be updated regularly, but the last thing I would say to the Commission is let's do another report. Let's have another, it's like the competition report, it's like this, it's like that. I don't think that's necessarily a good idea, but maybe more, I hate this expression, but like a tiger team approach, where you really are thinking about these issues, which I know you are, but doing workshops, doing things that actually just, to continue to press, the knowledge and making sure people are very well informed about what's going on. I just, like I said, I hesitate saying we need a new plan.
Yeah.
And frankly, all of that said, and then what you look at what the Commission did with high band spectrum, not in the plan, not conceived of, and dealt with in record time. That was a recommendation.
You're talking about the Spectrum Frontiers.
Yeah, the Spectrum
proceeding.
Frontiers. 3 years ago, the Technological Advisory Council said, we think you ought to look at high band spectrum. So they did. They did an NOI, then they did an NPRM, and they've now got an order and a further notice. And it's, and we're going to be, launching service on it next year.
So I tell you, I did mention to the principal author of the broadband plan, Blair Levin, that there was no mention of 5G in the plan, and he said, well, if you look, in fact, the chapter on spectrum is chapter 5. So he clearly got it. Erin, I'm going to give you the last word, but Berge, I wanted to bring you in on this discussion too. Do you have any thoughts about that second input in terms of how well it is or isn't working?
Sure. I actually think we're at a turning point regarding spectrum, both by policy and by utilization. And it may not be obvious to all the attendees what that turning point is. For one, we're sitting in the middle of what I think is the last spectrum auction in the United States, which, by the way, is at a bit of an impasse at the moment because of the complexity of the auction. We're not really allowed to talk about it. It's a quiet period, but it just generally in the press, you can tell that there's a gap between the buyers and sellers, and that gap isn't closing very quickly. So my point is, for the last 10 years, 4G spectrum has been brought to market by way of auctions. And the government has benefited by selling spectrum to the carriers, and the carriers have had a tremendous amount of demand to get that spectrum. In order to achieve the goals of 5G, the FCC's had to reach up to much higher frequency bands, and lo and behold, other people occupy that spectrum for the most part. There are some cases where you can acquire that spectrum and have it become part of your portfolio. Verizon has done a nice job of that with XO. And I think having 28 gigahertz spectrum available is a very big advantage without having to go through an auction or a licensing process, and being able to repurpose LMDS into 5G is a very interesting idea. We'll see how it works out and how effective it is. My point, though, is a lot of the other bands really are going to be delivered based on another premise called sharing, which really hasn't been part of the way spectrum was delivered to the industry. And it's unclear how much revenue would be derived through sharing, or whether the mechanisms that are being tested in the 3.5 band for the SAS systems, how effective they'll be and how well they'll work. But in fact, it's critical that they do work and that the infrastructure is put in place to allow that. so that we can release and make good use of government-occupied spectrum, satellite dish spectrum, all the different bands that are being contemplated. So I think we're at a turning point, and I think we have to rethink what does licensed and unlicensed mean? What does shared spectrum enable? And do we only share spectrum between carriers and incumbents? Or in fact, should we think about the carriers themselves sharing spectrum? If there's 300 megahertz block of spectrum that's in common use and it's released because of spectrum sharing, why couldn't T-Mobile and AT&T share it? Why couldn't Verizon and AT&T share it? That's not the culture. People like to own their own spectrum, but it's inevitable that sharing is going to be the phenomena. So I think that's important to think about.
Yeah, I have to just say one thing. We have 320 million customers. We share spectrum all the time with T-Mobile's through roaming. And we've been doing it a long time. So there is a really fundamental sharing proposition. I think you are saying something a little different than that. But it's not that we, aren't able to kind of work out those arrangements. I have other things I'd love to say, but Linda clearly.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point. So again, going back to federal policy and some American thought leadership, one of the things we meet often with other countries, and we have really pioneered this concept that perhaps in the future, and again, we're working through this at NTIA, especially because we oversee the federal spectrum, is whether it would be possible for commercial users or commercial companies to share with federal users. And we've been with other countries and other carriers, and they look at us like, what, are you crazy? Oh my God, we would never do that in our country. I mean, even countries in Europe and other places that they just can't conceive of sharing federal spectrum, particularly, or defense, or FAA, or anything else with the commercial sector. So that's a place where we are certainly looking at and pioneering. And we are also, again, from a U.S. perspective, one of the things that we can do from a government is do some test beds, some pilots. And we have a lab out in Boulder, Colorado, ITS, and they are looking at some of the spectrum sharing technologies. They're also doing some testing to determine if a city were fully deployed with lots and lots of sensors, what would the interference look like if you have lots of different companies and industries all trying to operate at the same time in the same environment. So I think there are some things that the federal government can do to help support and facilitate innovation in this area.
And we should say, for people who don't understand, but NTIA manages government-owned spectrum in the way that the FCC manages non-governmental owned spectrum. So Erin, I want to get you in on this as well. I see you write a lot of notes, so I assume
basically it's like, wow, yeah, we've covered a lot of things in one question, and now I have a sneaking suspicion I'm not going to hit everything I want to hit, but I'll start with the beginning of the conversation, which is the idea of a plan, and I absolutely agree with Charla. Aspirational goals are nice. But the second you finish the plan, it's basically out of date. And the amount of resources that the commission had to use to create that plan maybe was not the best way to use resources in the long term. Because any plan we have anymore, it basically has to be a living document. I think that's what sort of the broadband plan showed, is like we came up with okay, we want X megahertz of spectrum by Y date. And it's great to have that, but anymore, you need you need the pipeline. You need to know sort of what spectrum bands you're going after at what time. And I'm certainly not saying that to attack federal government spectrum holders or anything like that, but what we've figured out is that going forward, especially because, as you're saying, there's so many incumbents already on the spectrum, you have to go through a work process. It's not that we just get to, global harmonization is a goal, so you have steps that you need to take. So you need to be able to highlight which spectrum bands you're going after so that you can deal with the incumbents issues, you could deal with the international issues. And that's not a process that happens overnight. So as we go on, you can never stop thinking about what is coming next. And not only that, as Charla alluded to, Obviously, there was no 5G in the National Broadband Report. Now we're looking at low-band spectrum, mid-band spectrum, high-band spectrum. Then you're looking at what, on the sharing context, what is going to be licensed, what is going to be unlicensed. There's still a need for licensed exclusive use spectrum. There's also a need for shared spectrum. So different bands are going to be used and for different purposes. If you can clear the band, it should be used for exclusive use licenses. But if you may not be able to clear it, in that case, you're going to go towards sharing. So, I mean, that is a very dynamic structure now. It's not the old-fashioned voice and data where you're going to say, well, we need 250 megahertz, because that was just for license. So it's a more dynamic calculation than what has been done in the past.
Okay, I want to move on, but Charla, if you
Yeah, just
really quick.
just a quick comment. First is I just wanted to be clear that you can have the benefits of exclusivity within a shared environment. And the commission actually did that with the Spectrum Frontiers order. We're sharing with satellite. There are rules about that sharing. But in that context, there are actually exclusively defined borders of areas where licensees will operate. And guess what? It will be auctioned. Any of the remaining spectrum. And there will continue to be auctions. It is, as we've heard said any number of times, it's an all of the above solution. Yeah. And it becomes even more important in this environment. You need unlicensed spectrum. You absolutely are going to have to share. I mean, we've been very actively involved in the 3.5 gigahertz proceeding for just that reason, is that we think it's a fabulous opportunity to get access to spectrum that if you didn't share, it wouldn't be available. So, all of that is going to be, I firmly believe there will continue to be, some form of auctions. How big they'll be, what spectrum they'll be remains to be seen, but it'll be part of an overall plan to do a lot of different things.
And just to be clear, when you say exclusive, even within this, exclusive can mean exclusive area, exclusive
for a particular
time,
geographic time.
On Mondays.
Yeah, and the benefit, and actually some of those the benefits don't always accrue, the economic benefits that people like to talk about if it's just time.
Yeah.
But if you've got sort of frequency and geography and you have the ability to mine your spectrum, it's what we did as carriers between cellular and 5G, which the fact that we knew that we could do what we needed to in that spectrum without any interference from other, parties, made a huge difference in our ability to move forward.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
do the
Well,
types of
Just
things.
one last thing, just to
Really
build on
quick.
that. But yeah,
Sorry.
this is really quick. So, I mean, what Charla said, as far as creating this sharing structure as part of the Spectrum Frontiers order, of course, there was a further notice that we also cannot totally ignore, where we said, okay, we're going to share here, this is going to be exclusive use, but we'll look at future sharing opportunities through the further notice. So that's something that's still being considered and would most definitely affect how the licensed carriers would use that spectrum and how they would bid on it at auction. So there's still issues to be resolved there.
Okay. So before I get to the next big topic, which may be our last big topic depending on the timing, but just a side note, I want to sort of sidetrack for a second. So in the earlier panels, we heard a lot about applications that some are low latency and high availability required, some are just low latency required, some are one or the other, and some, by the way, sort of the daily check-in with the toaster, which may be extremely low reliability required, can happen any time in the background. This invariably brings up the question of prioritization within existing bands and within existing services, even ones that are using the public internet. So Brian Hendricks raised the point for us, well, what does this have? How does this relate to the Open Internet Order, which bans paid prioritization? Maybe it's a specialized or differentiated service. Maybe it's part of reasonable network management. But if we have the entire Internet of Things and all the smart city applications become differentiated services or specialized services, we start to maybe think, well, maybe the prioritization rule wasn't a good idea in the first place. Erin, I'm going to ask you to weigh in, anybody else who wants to. Is there a problem here in the future, or we're okay?
Well, when you introduced me, you said that I worked for Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, who dissented against the entire item. So I would say that, no, it was not a good idea. I'm sure there are many people who are very surprised by that. So Yes, I mean, there are many issues that, were raised by the net neutrality item. And obviously, because we don't know exactly what 5G is going to look like, except for the fact that there will be some applications that need higher speeds, some need lower latency. Now, to start with the paid prioritization rule, I mean, you're not allowed to prioritize traffic in return for compensation, or if it happens to be your affiliate programming. But what is also in there is an interesting little waiver, if it's in the public interest, to avoid that rule. Now, no matter what, that is still creating a mother may I type situation. May I do this? It's not permissionless innovation. You're not just going to go do what you want to do, which is how wireless became as successful as it is today. And even if you manage to not meet the paid prioritization standards as far as compensation goes, or affiliate programming, there's still the general conduct standard in our net neutrality rules. Now, that basically, I mean,
Which, just refresh us, it
Yes.
says,
you can't do anything that would be discriminatory for any future technology that would go over the internet. The easiest way to think of it is how the chairman actually himself has described it, which is the FCC is a referee on the football field. We get to throw down the flag if it's something we don't like.
Okay.
So it is very amorphous. Nobody really quite knows what it is. But right now, we know that we have 4 investigations going on zero rating. So that started a year ago. Questions have been asked. Everybody knows, it was very public, who was being investigated, what services were being investigated. Meetings have gone on. There's been no answer as to what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. There appears to be no answer forthcoming. So this is the type of situation that we will be facing as we go into 5G, which is either under a waiver standard or under the general conduct standard. Either way you go, you're coming to the commission to get the okay. The commission will give that okay, apparently, when they feel like it. So is that a good system? I would say no. Obviously, there are other people at the commission who will say otherwise.
okay. All right, unless anybody else wants to weigh in on that, and I don't imagine there is. Okay, so let me move on to happier topic. So we heard a lot about public-private partnerships in both the previous panels. And I think, the way to think about it is where can we find win-wins? And what sort of obstacles that maybe aren't really helpful anymore, that may go back, long history of sort of ways in which cities operated or ways in which private companies operated. In this context, they don't make sense. Maybe we can get rid of them. Maybe we can streamline, I think, to use it. So let's talk about the private partnership. And I'll start with you, Jamie, because you brought it up. What is left to be done here? What can be done on both sides to kind of clear away some of the rubble that makes private partnerships still difficult or unnecessarily difficult? What else can we do? What are we doing? And maybe you have an example, and maybe some of the others have examples as well.
Well, I think there's a lot that we can do. I mean, first of all, I agree, we need to help these cities, and I know they're struggling. But it doesn't help anybody whether the city.
Your mic.
Sorry, I turned it off as I was.
I have a little bit of a cough, so apologies. So I absolutely do think that we have to work with cities. It doesn't help anybody when a city gets overwhelmed and they go into moratorium. It doesn't help the city because they get left behind, and it doesn't help the industry because we can't do what we need to do. I think that the industry needs to be a part of it, but I also think the communities need to be a part of it. I don't know, it was my apologies, I couldn't be here this morning. But did you talk about Columbus, Ohio? And what they did?
So the answer is no.
So there was the DOT did a Smart City Challenge, and they were, it was a large amount of money, I think it was $40 million, that would be made available to the winner, and the city of Columbus, Ohio won. And some people who were part of the process said that the reason why the city won against, I think there were 77 other cities who were applicants, was because everybody was all in. The community was in, local businesses were in. The local business community I think they said they would give $90 million to the project if Columbus won. Paul Allen, through his corporation, made a contribution, and the entire community was involved. So I think it absolutely, we have to be part of the solution, but I also think that local business and the entire community has to get behind this. And I think those are the kinds of public-private partnerships that will really, those should be the model and will really set the stage for success.
So I'm going to give Linda the last word on this, but I want to bring in Berge and Charla as well, because again, you have unique viewpoints on it as well. So talk to us some about, again, what the real obstacles are to these partnerships and what can be done creatively to make them more win-win.
So it just so happens I'm from Boston, and Boston is
We never would have guessed.
We never would have guessed.
Why, do I sound like I'm from Boston? I try not to, but anyway. I'm just jealous we're not in the World Series, but anyway, Boston is unique because it takes a collaborative approach to addressing these issues. By the way, we're hosting a Smart City Summit. I think Verizon is a sponsor coming up the first week of December. And I published an article along these lines on smart cities in the era of 5G, which highlights kind of the unique collaborative approaches that different cities are taking in order to accomplish the goals and achievements that you're talking about. And I think it starts with a really fundamental premise, that we're all trying to solve the same problem, that we're not trying to be an obstacle to another set of actors and they're achieving their goals, but in fact we're working together. So it requires, rather than blowing the wind or shining the sun down on the emperor to take off his clothes, it requires all of us to take off our clothes to feel comfortable together.
It's not what I said. It was a cloak. It's the coat,
Whatever,
Berge.
cloak. My
Yeah,
point
it's
though
not-
is,
and he was a
my point,
traveler,
though,
not
is-
the emperor.
He's making up for the fact he's the only boy on the panel.
This is like a.
I'm sorry I'm
little
starting this down this road. What I meant to
Down
say
here.
is
Nice to know.
that we all have to put our cards on the table.
Much better.
We all have
Agreed.
to say, what assets do we have, right? What do we have to put out that can be beneficial, right? So for example, it may be better to site small cells on public property than on private property, if we can come up with the right arrangements for that. And second, what do we need? What do we want from this? What do we get in return for this? Third, what are the benefits that we can derive and our citizens can derive from densification? And in fact, you know, if you ask people who are citizens, do you care about densification? Probably don't know or don't really have any reason to think about it. But if you give them practical examples of what the impact of not densifying is, to find out that, you know, their wheel is turning all the time and they can't get service in the urban areas and their commute is terrible and all. There's so many things that they benefit from. And I think all those can be put into this stew of collaboration. And I think Verizon and Boston have created a great test bed for that.
Charlotte, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure I
highlight that,
have.
or
I don't know if I have that much to add to what I was saying earlier, but I will say that what is critical, all the things that both of you have mentioned, but you know what made it work is also having a very strong mayor and somebody who went at the leadership, you know, on the city side. It just basically saying, oh, you know, this is something I want my city to look like this, and so to the extent we can help cities, communities understand what looking like this really means, I think we can
And there
move
are
down a
mayors
path.
and city officials like that in many, many different cities
agree.
that are progressive, future-oriented, and want to do business. And, you know, I don't think Mayor de Blasio is any different. I think they're all kind of moving down this path. And I think the more we can get them on that side of the table, it's better off for all of us.
Right. So Linda, so we're talking about partnership between entities of all kinds and cities. But what's the role you think the federal government can play in encouraging this collaboration and clearing this kind of, clearly the federal government has been playing a role here. So tell us a little about that and tell us why you think it's important for there to be a federal role.
Great. So that's a great setup. Thank you, Larry. We are actually working cross-agency right now. I'm representing the Department of Commerce on a smart cities strategy. And this came out of the PCAST, the President's PCAST report that was published last February. And because smart cities are you have to think about it's a hyper-localized interest. So each city is going to be very different and have water problems or energy problems or something that's specific to them. We don't want to take a top-down approach from a federal government and say, this is what your city should prioritize or this transportation system is right for you. So it does create a situation for the federal government. How do you then facilitate that innovation? So a few of the things that we've done already, Jamie talked about the Department of Transportation, their Smart Cities Challenge. And what we are looking at is, one, as a federal government, are there things that we could do, number one, to convene the parties? Number two, are there lessons learned? Can we issue toolkits? Can we generate best practices? That's not something that an individual city would do necessarily, but looking at it from a federal government perspective across cities, that's a very important role that we can play. We can also fund research, do test beds, pilots on certain areas that maybe a particular city wouldn't focus on, but then could help push forward all cities at the same time. And these are some of the strategies and kind of big picture thinking that we're going through right now when we're looking at what the federal strategy should be. And the idea is we would then seek input from the public sector. And also, I think this is going to be about teeing things up for the next administration, because obviously we're about to go through a change in administrations. But what we want to make sure to do is do a lot of the groundwork up front so that when the next administration comes along, they don't have to start from scratch. They have some thoughts, some suggestions, hopefully some industry support for a strategy and some pretty good tools. I think the last tool I'll mention is that NIST from the Department of Commerce just yesterday actually kicked off their Global Cities Team Challenge Supercluster meeting. And what they've done is brought together superclusters, which they describe as transportation, for example, is one. So you may be, Wi-Fi is another. So if cities all have an interest in their transportation, smart cars, autonomous vehicles, whatever they are interested in, they could come and learn from other cities. So Portland, for example, is heading that up. That was one of the 7 finalists in the Smart City Challenge from DOT, and they really feel strongly that they can learn from one another. And that's really important in this situation when you have cash-strapped cities and folks that are trying to move in this area without a lot of resources.
That's great, thank you. So I actually have 4 more topics, but no more minutes. So I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there, but please thank the panelists, and we'll move on.
I'm going to turn it over to Peter and Larry to sketch out and be more specific about some of the highlights that we hope that you take with you. So, Peter and Larry.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks, everybody, for attending today. I just wanted to highlight some key points today. They don't necessarily summarize everything that was said because there were many insightful comments made, but some of the items I heard was about the huge range of smart city applications. There is no end point. There is no stage where a city says, okay, now we're smart, now we're going to worry about something else. This is also a global phenomenon. Cities all over the world are working on this. The US is not necessarily in the leadership position. I heard Singapore mentioned many, many times today and last night. So I think cities can learn from each other. Some applications are so obvious and so lucrative financially that they pay for themselves. For example, smart lighting. I think that's an interesting observation. From a technology point of view, 4G capabilities today support smart cities extremely well, especially with new capabilities coming online this year, next year. And then 5G just augments the capability. There are cloud developments. And then even artificial intelligence, the processing of all that data. There is a concern among technologists such as myself and others that many of the 5G use cases do depend on traffic prioritization. The only way you can guarantee that that car will not hit that pedestrian is if those bits of information do have higher priority than somebody's Netflix movie stream. So that is going to have to be addressed. All spectrum bands are important. There isn't just one smart cities band. So I expect a lot of developments in that regard. I think we're making good progress. And then finally, I heard that densification is going to be an important element for many applications. So whatever policies can support easier siting and densification for these networks, that will be a win. So those are just some of the key items that I heard today.
Well, all I have to add is, first of all, thank you all very much for coming. Peter and Carolyn did all the hard, heavy lifting in terms of designing the program and figuring out this really fantastic half-day plus of programming. So please join me in thanking them and thanking you.
All right, thanks everybody, and hope to see you the next time.